Hey there, this is Paula from the Afford Anything podcast, and the interview that you are about to hear is special bonus material that I recorded live on stereo. So if you want to hear my special live stereo interviews, head to stereo.com/paulapant, download the app, follow me there, and you can listen to these interviews live. Now, with that said, on to the show.
Hey, Erin.
What's going on?
How? I feel like it's been forever since we've spoken.
Yep, it's been a really, really long time.
Oh. So, Erin, this is supposed to be a conversation about behind the scenes. How do we run our business? How do we run our business? How do we do it, Erin?
Well, we don't email.
Yes.
I was going to say, actually, it's been a really long time since we've talked via email. That's true.
Yeah, exactly. I went through this thing in 2020 where like all of a sudden my email was just produced. It began to be such a major source of anxiety that I could not deal with it anymore. Like I was getting getting physical symptoms just from like the thought of checking my email. And there was
Yeah.
more behind that as well, but yeah, I definitely I had to take a very sudden and unexpected retreat from email.
It's such a presence in our lives that we don't often question it. But one thing I heard yesterday, I was telling you earlier today, for people behind the scenes, we did have a meeting today in preparation for this call, but Cal Newport was talking with Jason Fried, the founder of Basecamp, and Jason has this product. It's a paid email service called Hey. And he was saying that the way they designed it was based on the fact that email is an obligation. Like anytime an email comes into your inbox, it's asking something of you. And I thought that was such a great perspective because we often just don't think about it. It's just email is something that happens to us. It happens naturally. It's a thing that we've just come to accept because that's the way people communicate. And when he said that, it was just like, yeah, anytime we go into our inbox, there's just a bunch of other people's priorities, like something, whether we have to mark something as read, whether we have to confirm a meeting. And the thing I'm looking at right now is Cal's book says, chapter 2, email makes us miserable, an epidemic of silent suffering. So you are totally not alone.
Right, exactly. Right. And so you and I, like, we primarily communicate. We've tried a number of things. Like, you and I have worked together for maybe around roughly 6 years, 5 or 6 years at this point. And there was a time in the past, and this was when we were doing a lot more like contract work with third-party agencies, where Asana was a bigger tool in the way that we ran things, because we were doing like content management and marketing for all of these various companies. And so we would have like all of these clients that we had to serve. And so we were using Asana as, both a task management and communication tool. And we stopped doing that, many years ago. And now we're going to get back, or our plan is to get back on that, and make that a bigger piece of our lives. But prior to doing that, like right now, we primarily communicate through a shared Google Doc that we just each update, as well as standing meetings. Like you and I meet every Monday and every Friday. And then we communicate via Google Doc in between.
Yeah. Yeah, and if something that comes up same day that we need to take care of more urgently than not, then we'll just text each other.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, like yesterday was a perfect example where I didn't have time to check the Google Doc prior to leaving for a meeting, like for a physical face-to-face meeting, one of those rare face-to-face meetings that doesn't happen very often these days. But yeah, I was like, didn't have time to check the doc and then had to like run out the door. And so I just sent you a long text message where in one message, I'm like, all right, here's everything. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And it was like how I could kick off the day. It was how I could communicate with you what I was doing that day. And having like one text with everything in it was, I think, it's a much better structure than if those were 4 separate emails.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The tip that I would share for anyone listening who might not love their phone, like I accept that I'm a weird person for this, but I don't actually like to have my phone near me. I like to get as much productive time as I can into the day. So typically I'll leave my phone behind in some fashion. But I know it's probably easier for iPhone users, but for Android users, I often wonder, like, how can I get this on my computer? Because typing is much faster than texting, just for efficiency's sake. And apparently you can just go to like messages.google.com or something, and it brings up, you just link your phone with it, almost like WhatsApp. And you can use messaging on your web browser. So that's how I've
Mm.
made it work for me.
Oh, that's awesome. That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Yeah, and as for iPhone, you can do the same thing with iMessages.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Oh, I also want to say now we had 9 people listening live. I think we're down to 7 now. But if anybody has a question that they would like to ask, feel free to ask a question. We've got a moderator who's listening in, so feel free to pose your question, and the moderator will moderate it and then kick it over to us.
Yeah.
So, one thing that I want to talk about, and this is for the benefit, I think we'll probably have a replay of this conversation for anybody who wasn't able to listen live. And a lot of the people who are going to be listening are people who are small business owners or entrepreneurs, or who aspire to one day be an entrepreneur or a small business owner. And one thing that I think is not discussed enough, but that is important to know, is there's a distinction between managing and doing, and there's also, look, if you think of a company, like any company, there is an organizational structure, and there are all of these different roles within the company. So for example, you would have in a company, you would have a chief marketing officer, and underneath that you would have the social media manager, and you would have the person who is in charge of relationships and partnerships with outside brands and vendors, and you would have the person who's in charge of paid advertising campaigns, and data collection and data analysis around that. And you'd have the person who's in charge of, you have all kind of, in a bigger company, you would have all of these various people who all, work in different aspects of the field of marketing, and they all report to the chief marketing officer. And then in a different division, you have a bookkeeper and an accountant, and they report to the chief financial officer. And the CFO is also then the person who keeps track of all of the revenue and like kind of has a handle on it. And they would also be coordinating with like whoever is in charge of strategy and growth, when it comes to new partnerships or new product development. Like in a big company, you kind of have all of these tasks and roles. And when you're running a small business, those tasks and roles still exist. It's just that you have fewer people who are filling them. If you're a one-person company, for the people who are listening to this who are solopreneurs, if you're a one-person company, then you're the one who's doing all of it. And then if you grow into 2 people or 3 people or 4 people, you like those tasks and roles still exist. It's just that the hats, you have like fewer people and they're switching hats throughout. So I guess there's not like I don't have like a question or even anywhere that thought is particularly leading. It's just that I myself sat down and sketched out an organizational chart for Afford Anything the other day. And I was shocked when I looked at it, because I didn't realize how much, Erin, I didn't realize how much both of us were doing until I wrote that out. And then I looked at it and was like, whoa. Yeah. And like Cal Newport talks about attention switching residue, like anytime you're moving from one task to another, there's the residue that comes from moving, that's task switching attention. And Cal typically talks about it when it comes to being interrupted by email or being interrupted by a Slack messaging. But I think the same is true when you're switching from your work in wearing one kind of hat for an organization to your work wearing a different type of hat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was reading the first chapter of his book and I was highlighting some statistics because they just were so shocking, because you don't feel that when you're in the middle of it. You're just like, oh, this is my work day. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And he was citing a study from the summer of 2018 that says, like, for half the users studied, the longest interrupted interval of work time that they had was no more than 40 minutes, with the most common length clocked in at a meager 20 minutes. So more than 2/3 of the users never experienced an hour or more of uninterrupted time during the period studied. Like, how are you supposed to get anything done?
Wow.
Anything meaningful? Like, we don't have a lot of productive time built into our days. So being able to systematize everything gives us back that productivity, like time that we can spend doing deep work or things that matter to the business more than just, swapping emails back and forth with people trying to organize things.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, Erin, you do a lot of video production, and that requires, that requires a ton of focus. Like, you have to storyboard the video. Like, what is your process for that? You storyboard and then you look for B-roll and you look for images. Like, there's a lot of pieces to it.
Yeah, I mean, I am a little bit of an amateur video editor. I've had experience just in our workspace doing it. So I kind of just figured out my own system, what worked for me alongside learning how to do it. So basically the thing is we script out everything. I take the script and I storyboard from the script. So I'll figure out sentence by sentence, what does this lend itself to? A slide, B-roll, a picture, like, what do we want to show on the screen at this time? Or do we want Paula, just talking head video? So once I get through with that, I usually batch it together where I'll make all the slides together. I'll look for B-roll in this chunk of time. Then I'll look for images in this chunk of time. So I separate everything out because it just makes the most sense to me. I've tried going through line by line and like switching from looking for B-roll to making a slide to looking for an image. And I found that was just not useful. So that's kind of my beginning process. I get everything together. Then I open the video file. And I usually edit the video beforehand if there's any dead space or anything we need to cut. That's already done. And then I just lay everything on top of the video and piece it all together, like moment by moment. So yeah, even in that process itself, I try to simplify as much as possible and batch things together.
Right. And the way that you describe it, I mean, it's like, it's certainly a mind-consuming project.
Mm-hmm.
For that to be interrupted by like the ping of an email or the ping of like a chat box. That's just like, it sounds like it would just be torture for like the project.
Yeah, I find myself doing, when we're in video production mode anyway, I find myself doing a lot of that in the evening because most of the time email kind of shuts down. And I think you've experienced this as well. You were telling me recently that you enjoy working on the weekends because there's no obligations on your time. Like there's nobody asking for your attention in your inbox or something else like that. So you can focus more. And actually there was an example in Cal's book too, where he was interviewing a CEO of a company and he was saying that he preferred staying up till 1 o'clock in the morning because that was when he found he was the most productive because no one was bothering him.
Right.
So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Whenever I have, if there's a project, like if I want to do a bunch of research actually, I was just telling you this earlier today, Erin, that I've got an interview coming up on the podcast that is, it's more of it's going to be more of a technical interview. It's going to be more of a technical conversation. It's an author by the name of Ed Slott, and he wrote a book called The New Retirement Savings Time Bomb. And in order, like, it's a dense book with a lot of financial information. It's not the type of thing that you can skim through quickly. And so in order to prepare for this interview, I need to like really slowly read and focus on his book and take really good notes. And during the work week, there's just not time for that. So Like I look to weekends as time to be able to do that deeper work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes, especially as a small business and being an entrepreneur, the one benefit that you have is being able to control your time and work when it suits you. And Cal really drives that point home a lot, saying like, you guys have the most freedom to structure your workplace as you would want it to be structured. You don't need to do email if you don't want to do email. So I think it's great to, once you have that realization, to start figuring out, okay, how can I make this work for me? How can I make my workday serve me instead of fighting against it?
Right. Exactly. 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 And we should say in this context, email is a stand-in for, we're using email as a catch-all term to also include Slack and any other kind of like instant messaging. It's basically, it's all part of like that hyperactive hive mind of lots of back and forth communication.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of what happens is like, there are a lot of workplace cultures where like how rapidly you respond to email is seen as indicative of like how hard you're working. And so there are then it almost becomes performative, right? People respond to emails, or people will see a whole bunch of people, extraneous people on an email and have a ton of CCs, not because that's the most efficient or productive way of getting something done, but rather because they are trying to like performatively position themselves as, hey, look at me, I'm working hard.
Yeah.
And that's like showmanship at the expense of actual results.
Yeah.
So for us inside of Afford Anything, we very much want to cultivate like a work culture that is not all about that. And it's funny, once you start doing it, like I've noticed that my own response, like when I deal with people in outside organizations that respond to email quickly, rather than it being a good thing, there's a part of me that's like, are you actually doing like the high paid job? Like, so for example, my trademark attorney, I filed for trademarks for Afford Anything, for Your First Rental Property. Like we have a number of trademarks that we hold. And my trademark attorney, when I email him, he emails me back right away. And I'm sure that he sees that as providing great client support. But honestly, he emails me so quickly that there's a part of my brain that's like, shouldn't you be spending your time like researching trademarks or drafting whatever it is that you do? Like, shouldn't you be spending your time doing the work, like the actual rare, valuable work that comes with having an expertise in trademark law? Like, wouldn't that be a much better use of your time than like hanging around by your inbox waiting for me to like email you about something that, where I could easily wait for an answer?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's just so unfortunate that that's the default expectation that's across the board.
Right.
And I have experienced this with our students in the course. Like, I love giving them great service. Like, we love making our students happy. That is one of our number one goals. And the thing I get hear most often from them is, wow, I wasn't expecting such a prompt response, but I'm really grateful for it. So it's that catch-22 too, where it's like people are appreciative of the fact that you got back to them quickly, but what cost does it come at?
Right.
So you're always trying to consider like, okay, well, I need to do the highest and best work to serve the business, but also have to serve the students. So we talked about this in the podcast outro, where we're trying to figure out what systems we can put into place where people don't need to hear from me anymore. They can just find the answer on their own. So both parties win.
Right.
But I think going back to your point, yeah, it's just a sucky situation for everybody when it's like the default is I expect a response within 24 hours. Like, we don't get a life. And, I wish more people would question that mentality. And that's why I love this book. Just A World Without Email. Like the title is so catchy. It really makes you think and pause and say like, yeah, what role is email and instant messaging and all this constant back and forth communication? What role does it have in my life and how is it affecting me?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I spoke to a book agent once who told me that the best titles are the ones that have some type of a promise, the 4-hour work week,
Mm.
Beautiful. There's a promise implicit in that title. And the same is true with A World Without Email. Like there's a promise of a better life implicit in the title.
Yeah.
One point that Cal Newport makes is that clarity trumps accessibility, which is
Yes.
yeah, I love that. I love that. So I hear that, as him saying, setting clear expectations is more important than being constantly accessible. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I know, Erin, one of the things that you've done is you have in your signature, in the signature line of your work email, it says is something to the effect of like, "Hi, thanks for reaching out. We will get back to you Monday through Friday within 24 hours."
Yep.
Yeah. And so it's like that immediate expectation setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and one change we made recently to your autoresponder on your email address was just don't expect a response,
Yeah.
which is very, very difficult to do because, again, we want to hear from everybody who's listening, everybody who's reading the blog. And it's just so tough to set that boundary. But we realized, as a small team, we have to, in order to keep producing the work that people come to love and that they want to hear from us, we have to set that boundary with them. So having that clear expectation of like, don't expect a response, but here's all these other ways that you can find the answers to your questions. And then if it's urgent, here's an email that you can reach. I think that also helps just set expectations very clearly. So people are like, oh, this is how things work. Okay, cool. At least I know. But before it's like, oh, I just sent an email and it just went somewhere into the void and I have no idea if I'm going to hear back from this person or not.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I guess we could talk a bit more about that because yeah, I did that. This was actually, I mean, it's been inspired by a handful of people, but most recently Dan Ariely, Dr. Dan Ariely, who was a guest on the podcast a few months ago. He's been a 2-time guest on the podcast. But most recently he came on a few months ago, and he is one of the most prominent behavioral economists in the world. It's not an exaggeration to say that even among behavioral finance professors and behavioral economists, like he stands out in what is already a very impressive field. And if you send him an email, immediately you get this it's set up like an away message. It's an autoresponder where he just says, "Hey, thanks for reaching out." And then here, I'm not going to be able to respond to you, but here's like where I can point you for any number of things. And then the whole body of his email is like, if you have a question about this, go here. If question this, then go here. If your question is this, the whole email is just a bunch of if-thens, that redirect people in various places and ways. And it's an immediate, it's like that immediate away message that's just set up permanently. And so we did that with mine as well. Oh, hey, we have a question that just came in.
Ooh.
So I'm going to tap this to play it. Let's see.
Interesting discussion. I wondered whether anyone can make a fair comment on the time before we had instant messaging in the workplace. So a lot of the discussions that I often hear from, business people and entrepreneurs that I've worked with is often an attempt to get back to a lost time. So if we think before the internet took off, let's say the mid-90s, even before that, was business more efficient? Was it more productive? Were people happier? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But before we had constant contact, were things better? I really don't know.
That's a really good question. So,
Mm-hmm.
Cal Newport, in the interview that we did with him on the podcast, he talks about that, where prior to email and instant messaging, a couple ways that people communicated. One was inter-office memos. And so they would circulate those inter-office memos. And those would sometimes they were physical memos that would go around on carts. Another way was meetings, meetings and phone calls. I think there were more phone calls back then than there are these days. Um, like now, millennials and Gen Z are sort of famous for our aversion to phones, or specifically to using our phone for the purposes of it being a phone. Um, and uh, and an increased number of meetings, some of which are useful and some of which are not. And so, I mean, certainly there can be a performative element to interoffice memos as well. You know, there could be like memo bloat where too many people are sending around a flurry of memos, um, to too many recipients for the sake of looking like they're doing something at the expense of doing anything. And similarly with phone calls, like phone calls are, as Cal describes in the podcast interview, an example of synchronous communication where both parties have to be on the phone at the same time, versus email is asynchronous. And I think that the advantage to what we have today, like the fact that there is asynchronous communication allows people to have more flexible schedules, since you don't have to both be on a phone call at precisely the same time. And the fact that it can be delivered digitally rather than through a physical paper memo that's circulated on a cart around a physical office, allows for location freedom as well. You don't have to physically be in an office because in order to receive that day's memos. And so I think that what we have now, like the fact that communication is digital allows for location freedom and remote work, and the fact that communication is asynchronous allows for choose it more of an ability to choose your own hours or make your own schedule. So to that extent, I think there's improvement in that workplaces today are more flexible in both time and location, but it can come, but that doesn't mean that these tools should be used in an unrestricted manner, or to put it in more financial terms, should be thought of as free. Like if you had to pay 25 cents for every email that you send or receive, you would think, you would probably send fewer emails if you had to pay a cost per email. But you wouldn't go back to never using email. Like even if you had to pay for every email that you sent or received, you would still use email. You just wouldn't use it as much because you wouldn't think of it as free. And I think Cal's point is that it's not free in terms of the cost on our time and energy. So let's not think of it as such. I don't know. Erin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the question is really interesting, especially the part of like, are we missing older, more simpler times without technology, beeping at us constantly? The first thing I'll say is that Cal also, he mentioned this in the podcast. He wrote an article for the New Yorker, was email a mistake. So definitely recommend checking that out because it might be an interesting read if you're interested in like the history and how email came to take over everything. But I agree, like largely we have more flexibility. It's just the thing is email is a tool and we're all kind of abusing it. And so the problem becomes setting boundaries, which a lot of people find very difficult for very valid reasons. So how do we make these tools work for us? It's kind of the argument of like, are credit cards evil? Well, if you misuse them, they can be like, it's just how do you use the tool? And I think that's the most interesting conversation about just how do we use these tools in a way that serves us? Okay, we set boundaries, we figure out systems and processes and just being able to work better and decrease the amount of overwhelm that we have. I mentioned in the outro, I think, how there's always just this sense of urgency. And then we talked about it earlier in this little post show, where it's just like there's always that expectation, it seems like, that everyone is responding to. It's an invisible expectation of like, you will get back to me immediately. Okay, yes, I will get back to you immediately. But what if you refuse to do that? What if you just see what happens if you don't get back to somebody immediately? Let a few hours pass. And obviously, you have to talk about this ahead of time if you're in a team, where if you don't want to be the cause of bottlenecking a project or anything like that. But I think there's just this assumption that we all take for granted that email is the way to do things, Slack is the way to do things. We have to constantly go back and forth with each other to be able to nail down a project. And Cal's book and the studies that are cited in it show that that's not the only way to do things. So if we can figure out how to work within these systems and figure out the processes that lend themselves to a better work-life balance, which I use that term lightly. I don't think there is such a thing. But if you want to achieve more balance, you can work towards these things. It just takes a lot of work. So if we can do that, like coupled with the location independence, like that is a huge thing that I know a lot of people right now are finding joy in. So I don't necessarily think that I personally would want to go back to older times, but I think we just need to rein in like how we use these tools and what notifications we let into our life.
Yeah. 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 I agree. I do think on the whole, it is better now. Like the location independence piece, and we saw an explosion of that in 2020, particularly. I mean, that's huge in terms of for so many reasons, right? It used to be back in the 80s or the mid 90s, like if you're a couple and both people have careers, but both careers are location specific, then just one person's career has to take priority over the others. Because if you have to move in order to be able to work at a given job, and if it comes up that one person gets an opportunity in New York, but the other person's job is in Boston or DC or San Diego, well, then you've got to choose like whose city is going to take priority, whose location is going to take priority. Or even, the other part of that is even if both of your careers are in the same city, but they're on opposite sides of the city, then whose job do you live closer to? Who's the person who has to, do you split the difference and live kind of in the middle so that both people have a terrible commute? Or do you live close to one location so that one person has a really easy commute, but the other person has a terrible commute? Like, those are all the trade-offs and the questions associated with like a dual income couple where the careers are location specific. And digital communication really allowed for that location independence to happen. None of this would be possible if it weren't for email, Zoom, Slack, Skype, like stereo, all of these communication tools that we have today. So I think that on balance, like that's a huge benefit for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we have another voicemail. Let's see.
One thing I'm finding I'm using more and more of in my business is actually voice messaging. So usually through WhatsApp, I'm finding more people inside and outside of my business are very comfortable with that. So it's not always realistic to get someone on the phone. So I think it's a really good medium in between email and a phone call, something you can get back to when you have the time to do so. And it's also something you can actually multitask with. You can respond while on the move, and you can also listen to someone's voice note while, I suppose, doing something else. So I find I'm using more and more of that, and I kind of hope more and more people get comfortable with that, because some people, of course, aren't comfortable with that and don't really like talking into the phone when there's no one on the other side. But yeah, I find that's getting more and more popular, and I'm using that a lot more.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point. And we use that too inside of our own team.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will often record, especially if I want to elaborate on something. If it's just going to take a long time to write it out, I'll record a voice, like an audio recording of myself talking something out, and then I upload it to a shared Google Drive folder. That between Erin and I. And Erin, I always tell you exactly how, like, I guess I communicate three things. how long the audio file is, I put that like right in the title, or in like when I communicate with you to let you know that something is in there. You know, I'm like, hey, 17-minute message. And then I'll tell you what it's about. And then I'll like also communicate if this is what we call like listen at your leisure, which means that it's like, don't worry about, you know, you like, this is nothing urgent. Like you get to it when you get to it, but don't worry about like pausing whatever you're doing, because this is, you know, just something that if you listen to it at some point during your life, that's fine. You don't need to listen to it today. So
Yeah. And a long time ago, I don't remember how long ago, we used like Voxer. Was that the name of the app?
Yeah, that's what it was called. I was trying to remember what it was called.
Yeah, so that kind of lets you send the audio messages back and forth, although it is another kind of back and forth. So it's interesting. You have to make sure that you don't get into the trap of like, okay, I'm going to respond to this right now. I think taking it out of an app, and maybe WhatsApp works in your situation. It sounds like it does. So, you know, everyone's different. Your mileage may vary. But for us, I think it helps to just get that separate email saying like, here's what this specific thing is about. Listen at like 2x speed because I'm rambling on about something. You know, you get the context for it rather than just like this thing just arrives. And you're like, okay, what do I do with it? I should listen to it right now, right? Because it's there. You have that pull towards it. The one downside, I will say, at least from my perspective, and this may just be because of the position we're in as a small team, where if you're giving me a lot of context, then I also need to take time to write everything that you're saying down because I need to process it and like think about it. If you're giving me direction on something, then I need to write it down because it's harder to like, I mean, I guess you could scrub through audio messages, but if you have, for example, like 10 in a given week, then it's like, okay, where was that one sentence that I need to remember? Like, it's just easier for me to keep track of if I make my own notes. So there's a slight downside to that, but overall it's like, well, you know, if you are elaborating on something, it's also helpful to hear somebody's tone of voice depending on what exactly is being addressed. So I will say that's the biggest upside for me is like just being able to hear someone talk it out is different than what someone, you know, someone might sound like just writing it to you. So I think the context of tone helps, but the downside is just having to write things out personally for me.
Yeah. And there's a transcription service that we use called rev.com. You know, that if anything needs to be transcribed, that's always an option, except that like the way that people talk is so different than what looks good when in a, you know, like transcriptions often are just so messy because speech is much messier than writing that it ends up, you know, a transcription. I find them personally, I find them to not be very reader friendly. And so they're not like, just not very enticing. It's like not something I want to read.
Yeah. I mean, I think the simple thing is like, it's just the cost of me synthesizing the information in my own way. Like I like to write things down. So it's me, like I'm listening to you, I'm writing it down. I'm also thinking about it as I'm writing it. I don't know. It just sticks better for me. So
nice. Yeah. It's almost like taking notes in class, I guess would be the analogy. Where like sometimes just the very act of taking notes helps the information stick. Brief aside, I remember in high school they brought in like a special, like a person who's an expert in how to study. Like they brought her in to talk to all of the high school students about like study habits. And she told us that if you write something down, you have a 5 times better chance of remembering it. And to this day, and I wrote that down, and to this day, I still remember it.
Perfect. Yeah. I wonder if that relates to the whole, like, you must write your goals down this way. Like, they're more impactful. You're more likely to achieve your goals if you write them down.
Yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. Or even like a couple of weeks ago, I created this document called Brain Dump of Everything We Could Possibly Do. And like, I don't intend for us to do everything on this document, and certainly not everything all at the same time. But I realized I had so many ideas for like growth that were all in my head. And I was like, I just need to get this out of my head and onto a page.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like a lot more relaxed after I did that.
Yep.
Like I didn't have the weight of having to keep it in my head any longer.
Yeah, I love that. That's one of the things that I've been telling people on our community platform, because there's understandably, a lot of people have anxiety about work, like ending the workday and then thinking about work afterwards. And I found what helps the most for me is just writing everything down, even if it's like in a sticky, like on a sticky pad that I keep at my desk or in Asana or whatever, doing a brain dump of everything I'm thinking about. Like, what do I need to get done tomorrow? What do I have to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks? Like, and then I'm able to kind of like back away from it and say, okay, it's there. It'll be there for me tomorrow. I don't have to worry about it. So I can stop thinking about it.
Right. Right.
So I guess what we're getting at this conversation is that everything is different for everybody. Find what works for you.
I'm curious for the people who are listening, if you have any stories that you want to share about things that you do in your workplace that are really helpful when it comes to like workplace communication and organization, or the opposite, like things that you absolutely can't stand. So feel free to share.
Yeah, there's definitely like back in my office days, there were meetings where I was just like, am I really needed for this? Like I could be working right now and doing like productive things instead of being here. Especially in a sales environment, it's just like high pressure, go, go, go all the time. So every moment matters. But yeah, we would always have like a Monday meeting and it was like, this has nothing to do with what I do in my job. So but again, meetings for the sake of having a meeting and being important, everybody being in the same room,
Right. Exactly. All right. We have another voicemail. So let's hear this one.
I do wonder, as this discussion progresses, whether or not we're just locked in the eternal struggle. This struggle will never be over. And as soon as a new communication method emerges, we have to fight to regulate it and then establish etiquette, because for example, WhatsApp voice notes, I love them for business. I'm based here in the UK. It works great. But I have relatives and friends who are in, let's say, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, where the etiquette is different because more of their lives are conducted on WhatsApp. So a lot more transactions. They pay things such as school fees. So their voice notes can run to kind of 4 to 7 minutes. Like they're like mini podcasts. So I just wonder whether maybe it's just dawning upon me both the wider implications for what you guys are talking about, but also the kind of constant struggle that we'll have as time goes on.
Yeah, I agree. Like I think that with any new technology, there is that period of time where the etiquette around it has to be figured out by like here's this tool. How are we all collectively going to decide how to use it? And that's just part of like the technology adoption process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. I don't know. It's strange for me because I don't like texting people. Like I'm just not a texter. Like I much prefer an email or something else. Like I also don't like phone calls. So I've kind of just decided I'm just going to run my life the way that I'm the most comfortable with, especially when it comes to personal life, which I got the sense of like, okay, I like WhatsApp for business, but with friends and family, sometimes boundaries get overstepped. And it makes sense. So if friends text me or something, like I kind of just make it known, like, this is just not my preferred method of communication. And if you text me, it may take me some days to get back to you. And being comfortable enough to put that out there so that, again, like going back to what we said earlier in the conversation, like expectations matter, so that they know like, okay, you received it. Okay, you might take a few days to get back to me or something. I think that's better than just ghosting somebody. So it's just still, maybe it's a little bit unrealistic. There are certain people in your life that really just want to hear from you a lot. But I would try and encourage people to set boundaries and try and just make the tools work for them in the best way possible. I know it's difficult. It's way easier said than done, but I just don't like getting sucked into the newest technology craze of the day. So I kind of refuse to participate in it a little bit. So
Right. Right. Yeah. And so one of the things that Cal Newport talks about is what he refers to as the any benefit hypothesis, where if if you're a farmer and you have to buy physical tools, then you're not going to go out and buy every single tool that's out there, because each of these tools have a cost. And so you're not going to say, could this tool offer any benefit? You're going to say, of all the tools that are out there, which ones will offer the greatest benefit or the greatest value for the dollar, or value for the space and the maintenance that it will require, value for output. And then you'll select a few key select tools accordingly. And with digital tools, we don't do that. With digital tools, if people tell us that it might offer any benefit whatsoever, many people rush to get on it. And so, among bloggers and podcasters, there's been a huge rush to TikTok and Clubhouse. And it just seems like an endless series of ands. Okay, cool. Now we're supposed to be on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and have a Facebook group. And also, did I say Pinterest already? That too. And now TikTok and also YouTube. And it's and there's no end to all of the ands. And Periscope, remember when that was big? And then there was Vine for a while. And then there was, what was the Google's one? Google had one. Google Plus? Was that what it was called?
Oh, gee, yeah. I don't remember. That kind of flopped, but yeah.
And so it just becomes this endless series of ands. And it's tempting to sort of follow the crowd and to wonder, am I missing out? But there's a different thing, when you can go into something in a deliberate manner, and do fewer things, but do those things more intentionally and more powerfully. I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because also you have to remember the other end is producing content. How are you going to do that while you're on all of these social platforms, unless you're repurposing the content from the social platforms on your website?
Right. Exactly. And even with repurposing, you and I have talked many times where I'm this is going to be the year of repurposing. We're not repurposing enough. But the thing is, there's as you pointed out the other day, Erin, there's a difference between being the manager and being the maker, the manager versus the doer. And it's enough of a workload to just create content. In order to repurpose, you have to be the director of it, you have to be the person who's thinking about, all right, how can I take this piece that has been created for YouTube and repurpose it in a way that's appropriate to Instagram, and also for the blog, and also for a specific subset of my email list, and also, and so you need a content director whose job is to think about how to repurpose all of these different pieces and what finessing each piece will need, if any, for the sake of that. Yeah. Right. And that's very different than being purely in the creator space where you're focused on the actual creation. So right away, those are just two separate roles.
Yeah. Yeah. Running a solo business is tough. Especially when you're just starting out and you have all these messages saying, be everywhere. You have to be on all the platforms. And it's no, don't, you'll drive yourself crazy and you won't have time to think. Again, going back to deep work, like when are you going to get time to do deep work if you're everywhere all at once somehow?
Right.
You know, to think about these things, even like the fact that, oh, if I had a content director, this might help me. You probably won't realize that because you're busy bouncing from fire to fire. Like,
Right.
so
Exactly. All right, we have another voicemail.
What makes a phone call such a daunting task? Because my sister, she hates phone calls, right? She gets anxiety about it. I don't understand why she does that, because I can just pick up the phone. But why do you prefer sending an email and then waiting for it to come back? Like, if you're on the phone, you can know straight away.
that's a great question. So that is fair. That is a totally fair assessment. Phone calls get things done much quicker. But I guess it's just an element of social anxiety. Like a parent on this conversation, like I'm just better at crafting emails. I'm better with written words. That's more comfortable to me than just speaking. Like I always write out a script before I go on a phone call with like a doctor's office or something, because I have to remember like, what am I calling about? Like it sounds so silly, but like my mind will be racing while on the phone, like trying not to make an idiot out of myself. So that's just something that I personally am trying to work through. But I totally agree. Like phone calls overall are more efficient. But if it's not a rush, then I don't mind sending a message and an email and waiting it out. So
Yeah. For me, I think the benefit it comes back to asynchronous versus synchronous communication. With asynchronous communication, then everyone can kind of work their own schedules. And if I have, if I've got 20 minutes before I have to go on to this next thing, then that's enough time to process a couple of messages right away. Whereas with a phone call, that's synchronous communication. We both have to be on the same call at the same time, and that requires coordinating our schedules. You know, yeah,
that's a good point.
So
Yeah, especially if you're a freelancer and you have like 20 different clients. Like hey, I want a phone call with you. I want a phone call with you. I also want a phone call with you. It's like Calendly to everybody, like trying to schedule all these phone calls. And like, you know, generally when people want a phone call, they'll just pick up the phone and call you. And that's just an intrusion in your schedule that you've tried to carefully plan out as well.
exactly.
So
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's an interruption.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we will wrap it up there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Erin, for discussing this world without email.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And thank you for the listeners who sent in excellent questions.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you to Alyssa, who is our moderator. So, all right. Thank you all so much. Make sure that you're following me here on Stereo, Paula Pant. And I'll see you. We're doing Stereo Lives every Friday. So I'll see you next Friday.
Awesome.
All right. Bye.
Bye.